And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas, gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today's June the 19th, widely celebrated in the U.S. as Juneteenth, a combination of June and 19th. Marks the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. Commemorates the day in 1865 when Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, bringing the news of freedom to the last remaining enslaved people in the country. It's interesting to note that been a lot of stories that have circulated about Juneteenth. It's, of course, the 170th day of this year. 195 days remain to the year's over with, and we'll start a new one. On June 17th, 2021, President Joe Anything for a Life Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, officially established June 19th as a federal holiday, recognized as a federal bank and postal holiday. A lot of government offices and financial institutions closing to observe that day. And I'm sure there'll be more stories coming up about this particular day. Well, let's see what stories we have in the news, because let's face it, folks, we live in interesting times. Switzerland confirms Iran talks postponed if the White House says Vance not departing tonight. Israel strikes Hezbollah in Lebanon. Switzerland's foreign ministry announced scheduled talks between the U.S., Iran, Qatar, and Pakistan have been postponed, adding the Swiss remain ready to facilitate the negotiations. The planned talks between the U.S., Iran, Qatar, and Pakistan have been postponed, but Switzerland remains ready to facilitate, according to the announcement. Relevant preparatory work in Bergenstock is continuing, according to the Foreign Ministry. They also said no additional information was available at this point in time. Yeah, and as I said, Israel's military strikes more than 80 Hezbollah targets after 4 soldiers were killed in southern Lebanon. What Hezbollah doesn't seem to grasp is Israel's going to do what Israel's going to do. You strike at them, they're going to strike back. Well, Obama Center's opening ceremony ridiculed for far-left ritual before star-studded show. Thursday ceremony marking the beginning of the Obama Presidential Center's opening weekend. Master ceremonies began with a left-wing land acknowledgement ritual, for which the entire event was promptly mocked. Valerie Jarrett, former senior advisor to Obama when he was president and the current CEO of the Obama Foundation, kicked things off. She said we'll take a moment to recognize the original inhabitants of the land upon which we are gathered today. We honor the Anishinaabe Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. Land acknowledgments have been mocked as performative left-wing routines completed to commemorate the Native Americans who once lived on land where an event was happening. An extension of the belief that the U.S. exists on stolen land. Of course, since this particular continent, according to history, had very few inhabitants prior to the crossing of the Bering Strait. Who were the original owners? I doubt anybody can tell me. Native Americans just arrived and set up shop, and everybody came after them. Just moved on to the land. But as many keen online observers noted, Democrats hosting the Obama Presidential Center's grand opening have no intention of returning that land to the people they believe are its rightful owners. Conservative commentator Steve Deese asked, wouldn't they prefer you to just give them their land back? It's all well and good to acknowledge the stealing of the land, but I would ask for proof that they owned it before you start talking about the fact it was stolen from them. Well, a man was fired by a firm after a virtual video shows him scolding dad for taking young daughters into the women's restroom. An irate customer went viral for scolding a father inside a gas station's women's restroom while he was helping his two young daughters has been fired by a Mississippi real estate firm. The social media post, the Starkville, Mississippi-based Overstreet Properties said it was aware of the videos circulating online showing a man who worked as an independent contractor for the firm. The conduct depicted in the video doesn't reflect the values of Overstreet Properties or the standards we expect from those who represent our organization. Our focus remains on providing quality service to our clients, patrons, and community. The company added it was no longer associated with the unidentified man who was first reported by TMZ. Well, there's folks have to learn this day and time. There are literally cameras everywhere. TSA sounds alarm after World Cup fans packed their bags with an American staple. Transportation Security Administration is issuing a serious warning to international World Cup visitors. Don't pack ranch dressing in your carry-on luggage. As the World Cup brings millions of international visitors to the U.S., a lot of fans are trying out American staples and apparently rushing to take them back home with them. One European wrote on X, "Why did nobody tell us ranch sauce is like crack? Europe, we need ranch ASAP." Enthusiasm ain't gone unnoticed by U.S. officials. June 16th on Instagram, the TSA alluded to international travelers transporting bottles of ranch salad dressing through airport security. If you're visiting for a very large sporting event and you happen to discover ranch while you're here, pack it in your check bag on the way home, not in your carry-on. Post added days since the last airport ranch incident, 0. On X, the TSA issued a similar warning and shared a photo of assorted oversized liquids, including a bottle of ranch dressing next to a sign reminding travelers of the agency's 3.4-ounce liquid rule. A lot of Americans got a kick out of the TSA ranch warning. Well, that's certainly a unique perspective. Jelly Roll's wife on the show breaks silence on the divorce, gets emotional about the final fight. She's setting the record straight about her divorce from Jelly Roll. In a recent episode of their podcast, Dumb Blonde, a 46-year-old podcaster spoke out about her divorce from the country music superstar, letting fans in on the intimate details that led to the shocking decision, dispelling rumors that there was any infidelity. She said, "On Mother's Day, we had a little bit of an argument, which I don't think details are necessary. And in that argument, I was so fed up and so tired, I just looked at him and said, well, then filed the effing divorce papers." Following this argument, she recalled packing a bag and leaving the house, noting, "I didn't talk to my husband for, weeks after that." Well, it's when you're dealing with human relations, There's all kinds of interesting ins and outs. Well, an emotional Major League Baseball broadcaster threw a fit over pitchers wearing Bible verses on hats during Pride Night. Longtime San Francisco Giants broadcaster Mike Krukow throwing a fit because a group of Major League Baseball players included Bible verses on their hat during Pride Night. He said, I think when you're a player and you come into this environment, it's your responsibility to notice how sensitive this city is in regard to that cultural freedom and religious freedom and just the way that you live your life, Krukow said on KNBR. And I think they were in for a rude awakening with the response, and it wasn't just from the gay community. It was from the Northern California community that supports the gay community. It's interesting that I think it's 0.03% of the population dictates to everybody else. It's literally unbelievable. Krukow was referring to Giants pitchers Ryan Walker, Landon Root, J.T. Brubaker, and Sam Hinges. Broadcasting defended the Giants organization, citing the franchise's long history supporting the LGBT community. There's an irony, too, because the Giants organization is getting dumped on as well, and that hurt me, he said. Well, he said it hurt him because he saw in 1994 they were the first team to ever take on the challenge of going against public opinion and the outrage of even associating with the gay community. The opening went out and said, we support the gay community. We support it until there's a cure day. We're going to raise money to fight AIDS, and we support the community. And they did it with love. Well, I think Rob Schneider said it best. The gay community gets a month. Veterans get 1 day. Those that died for this country might get a weekend, Memorial Day weekend. Well, Democratic candidate was grilled on stock trading after being duped with selfie request. What began as a selfie request turned into an ambush, pressing former Representative Elaine Luria, Democrat of Virginia, into her personal finances and stock trading while serving in Congress, according to a video posted by a top staffer for Representative Jen Higgins, Republican of Virginia. Elaine Luria, how much money did you make insider trading? An unidentified man on a video asked. Some of them have made tens of millions of dollars insider trading. You know, it's interesting. A lot of folks have gone into Congress worth very little. And by the time their stint is over, some of them are worth... one is worth over $250 million and swears that it was just her brilliance as opposed to insider trading. Well, another lawyer has joined Carmelo Anthony's appeal as the killer claims he can't pay for counsel. He secured another lawyer in his fight to appeal his murder conviction. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 35 years behind bars earlier this month for stabbing and killing 17-year-old Austin Metcalf at a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas. He since filed a notice of appeal. Collin County Court records indicate the criminal defense attorney, Laura Bracamonte Davila, is his current court-appointed lawyer. And before Davila was appointed, Fox News Digital learned that the court briefly appointed criminal defense attorney Donnie Perales. He no longer represents Anthony. While Davila is the current court-appointed appellate attorney, in an email to Fox News, Perales said it's expected the Anthony family be retaining an attorney for the appeal. Court records indicate days after his June 9th murder conviction, Anthony applied for what's known as a TDFA indigent packet in his appeal, which, according to the Texas Fair Defense Act, is where a defendant can apply for a court-appointed attorney if he or she's eligible. And to qualify, the defendant has to prove he or she can't afford legal representation. Anthony said he was penniless, destitute, and indigent. Two Port employed counsel to represent him on the appeal, and the court document filed on his own. Fox News previously reported that records indicate that the Anthony family was tied to several businesses in Louisiana and Texas, and even opened a business weeks after their son murdered Metcalf. Despite the appeals process, the Anthonys have yet to speak to the Metcalf family following the verdict, according to Austin's father, Jeff Metcalf. Well, I know there was a GoFundMe set up for Anthony, and several $100,000 was raised, which went to buying the Anthony family a new house, which I found fascinating. Well, the fitness trainer told friends she was scared for her life weeks before a body with matching clothing was found. Missing South Carolina fitness trainer told her best friend she was scared for her life. Person fitting the description of Elena Catherine Moore, 39, was found dead on Wednesday afternoon in Lexington, South Carolina, after she went missing on June 11th, last seen after leaving a Planet Fitness gym in Lexington. While the body hadn't been identified yet, the Lexington Police Department said the body fits the clothing description of the missing person. Sandra Campbell, who was close friends with Moore, told Fox News that something felt very different the last time she saw her on May 31st. She was scared for her life, actually said those words to her. Elena's one of her best friends, she said. I've known her probably 10 years now, really close, and tell each other everything. She's been that person for me for a long time. When Campbell asked what was wrong, Moore said she wanted to discuss it in private. She said, I can't talk to you right now, too many people around. We got to talk one-on-one. Campbell said she missed a call from Moore on June 4th and tried to call and text her back with no response. Shaw said it's unlike Moore to be walking alone at night. Well, apparently there's no evidence as to who might have done something to her. Governor Sanders reveals major breakthrough on education as the red state positions itself as a blueprint for the nation. As Democrats across the country criticize education programs in red states, Arkansas Republican Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders is touting a major achievement in her state. She hopes to serve as an education blueprint for all states, regardless of politics nationwide. The thing we're most excited about, she said, is the fact that so many Arkansas students are doing better now than they would have been doing Lee Learns legislation. Sanders told Fox News on the day her office announced a major breakthrough on education after implementation of a 2023 Republican-backed statewide education overhaul known as the Learns Act. Also raised the minimum teacher salary from $36,000 to $50,000, created the performance-based teacher bonuses, boosted literacy support, funded school safety initiatives, and banned critical race theory and classroom teachings related to critical race theory, gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexually explicit materials. Well, it's fascinating. I've got 5 degrees and didn't learn anything about critical race theory in any of them. And looks to me like education standards have certainly dropped. Well, J.D. Vance reveals President Trump's unbelievable ability that behaves like a spiritual dimension. Vice President Vance provided an intimate glimpse into President Trump's character, revealing a trait Americans may not know he has during an appearance on Hangout with Sean Hannity. He has the best instincts about human beings of anybody he ever met, he said. There's an almost like a spiritual dimension where he understands whether somebody's telling him the truth or not. Said he's consistently stunned by the president's ability to read people and discern their genuine intentions. Understands whether somebody's trying to pull one over on him or not. It's fascinating to watch. Vice President said so many powerful figures who meet with Trump, including corporate CEOs and world leaders, are no match for the president's instincts. He's the president of the United States, right? You got people who are constantly coming to the White House and asking for things. And it is unbelievable ability to sniff out whether that person wants this thing because it's good for America or he wants it because it's good for him. Well, I will say when I met President Trump in back in the 90s, he definitely had a friendly, open attitude, which was frankly surprising. Well, the pro baseball team has forfeited Pride Night game after players refused to wear themed jerseys, the organization says. Professional baseball team in Pennsylvania will be forfeiting a game Thursday that was scheduled to lead the team's Pride Night after players refused to wear LGBTQ-themed jerseys, the team announced. York Revolution of the Atlantic League, the same league in which Trevor Bauer plays, said the decision was not reached lightly in announcing the forfeit against Southern Maryland Blue Crabs Wednesday. The team was not afraid to throw its players under the bus in a rather scathing statement, saying it was deeply troubled and profoundly disappointed by the decision of those few players. Well, it's interesting to note how many organizations are adamant that their members must support Pride Day or Pride Night or Pride Month. What happened to freedom of choice? Apparently, we don't have it anymore. And finally, Democrats raked in millions from employees at firms newly identified as Chinese military companies. Democrats, among those recognized names in politics, have accepted millions of dollars in campaign contributions from top employees at firms the Pentagon recently designated as Chinese military companies operating in the U.S. Department of War owns UNIC, designated Alibaba, Baidu, and BYD as Chinese military companies, meaning these three firms, in the eyes of the U.S. government, are providing assistance to the People's Liberation Army through its military-civil fusion strategy or other means. Senior employees to each company, including executives, have donated roughly $2.6 million to Democratic political committees since 2020, according to a Fox News review of campaign finance filings. Well, folks you never suspect representing the People's Republic of China. Well, the last couple of days, we've been talking about the Polish Roswell. And certainly, it's become a very quiet major operation. We're going to talk about today some of the strangest forgotten conspiracy theories. You'd be surprised at the number of bizarre ideas people have espoused. And anybody who spent much time studying UFO phenomena can't help but notice that sometimes religious fervor that surrounds that subject. There are quite obvious examples that it's at work in the outlandish UFO cults that have developed, such as aliens and things like that. But there's also a very subtle religiosity that pervades the subject among UFO true believers, who maybe don't even realize how religiously and grossly actually are. Among those who truly want UFOs and aliens to be real, their belief becomes a form of faith. And at various UFO-related events I've been to, I've heard some of the strangest ideas espoused. Even more interesting, a recent near nonstop discussion about disclosure among diehard true believers has become intensely religious in its field. Disclosure is the notion that there's a coming revelation of all things UFO, in which the truth to be revealed. UFO fans, without realizing it, have put so much stock in this day that will supposedly change everything, that made it into a major spiritual event, similar to the rapture of the second coming. Just think of religious fanatics during the Middle Ages telling everybody who would listen, everything's going to change, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but when Jesus comes back, everything's going to change. Now consider those UFO fanatics doing the very same thing, as they ran on and on about as soon as disclosure happens, everything is going to change. Governments are going to collapse. Society will be transformed. Everything will be different. We'll enter a new age. Well, it's actually a religious impulse among UFO believers that has them look forward to a major UFO revelation in the near future. It's always in the near future, don't you know? Now take this same religious fervor and add in the conspiracy theory the government's getting ready to actively mix the faith of both UFO fanatics and traditional religious fanatics together by way of something that's been called Project Bluebeam. This particular conspiracy theory was the brainchild of a Canadian journalist by the name of Serge Monast. Really wrote the book on the subject. 1990s, he published his work, Project Blue Book, parentheses, NASA. In the book, he made wild claims that NASA is getting ready to use holographic technology to imitate both an arrival of UFOs as well as reproduce traditional religious imagery, using the sky as a backdrop. The tech was supposedly so advanced that it could turn the daytime skies into a movie screen in which huge holographic images would be beamed for the whole world to see. Aliens and angels mixing together. Kind of a bit much, don't you think? Well, according to Manas, the whole point of the project is to tailor the images to the beliefs of those viewing them. Folks of the Roman Catholic faith staring up from Rome, Italy, would look up and see Christ emerging from the clouds. Other religions in other parts of the world would see their own religious figures walking across the heavens. Those would also supposedly be visions of UFOs projected across the skies, so that the UFO true believers wouldn't feel left out. Manas claims the final touch will be when all the projected figures that whom the whole world's been intensely staring at suddenly merge to form one unifying force of God, which the government would use to control the whole planet. It's a weird theory, a wild one, frankly, but that was Manas' story, and he was sticking to it. While he was still breathing, that is. Gave several interviews in which he discussed the topic, and just as his book on the subject began to gain traction, he abruptly died. Death in 1996 was sudden and allegedly due to a heart attack. Now, there are conspiracy theorists, of course, who beg to differ. They insist he was likely killed by government enforcers for spilling the beans on their secret plans. It was this sudden death that really put the Blue Beam conspiracy over the top, since it played right into the minds of fringe conspiracy theorists who felt that Manas truly did have revelatory information that some force was trying to suppress by having him killed. Well, all that led up to the year 2000. Conspiracy theorists were constantly chattering on about Blue Beam, suggesting it can happen any time. Talk eventually died down, but it never went away, as was evidenced in the fall of 2024 when a sudden surge of UAP and UFO drones made an appearance over New Jersey. These objects defied any explanation. They flitted about for several weeks on a nightly basis. It was as New Jersey descended into a state of near hysteria that some people began to whisper that this was just the first step in the staging of Project Bluebeam. Seemed this conspiracy theory isn't fading away anytime soon. Of course, the wave of drones, mysterious drones that is, in New Jersey has died down somewhat, but it still raises its head periodically. Well, let's turn from Project Bluebeam to talk about Ethiopia and the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is a mysterious object described basically as a gold-plated box with an ornate lid. And this gold-plated box had large round rings on the corners so that long wooden poles could be put through them so it could be carried. These poles were then held by people who were assigned to carry the ark. No one was supposed to touch the ark with their bare hands at any point in time. A number of stories in the Bible about people who did touch the ark, whether intentionally or unintentionally, dying. Instead, those transporting the ark were supposed to handle it using those long poles. This was supposedly so they wouldn't contaminate the holy object. But there are conspiracy theorists who believed that it was really a means to prevent contamination from the object, which produced harmful radiation. Ancient people have had no concept about such things as radiation. So it likely would have been a whole lot easier to simply explain this object is holy and shouldn't be contaminated with your unholy hands, so don't touch it. If you do, you're going to be smitten with the wrath of God. A statement like that would have been more readily understood by ancient people than somebody trying to explain, hey, the ark contains a mini reactor. You have no clue what that is, but it emits invisible wavelengths of something called radiation, which can kill you. Well, the Bible records that there were, in fact, times when those handling the ark did indeed accidentally touch it, and the result was not good for the touchers. They died. Back then, folks attributed these deaths to the power of God, but as mentioned, conspiracy theorists have come up with their own ideas since that time. Some suggest maybe the ark was some sort of powerful device, as I mentioned earlier, maybe even a nuclear reactor of some sort. And if it was indeed a nuclear device, having somebody touch it with their bare hands would certainly be deadly, since the radiation alone would be enough to kill them. Of course, unless the gold-plated box had an extra layer of shielding not specifically mentioned in the Bible, it would make one wonder how anybody could stand even near such a device at all. But such practical details are no concern for conspiracy theorists. This powerful object, and said to decimate Middle Eastern armies who opposed the Israelites, later disappeared from history. It seems this disappearance coincides with the Babylonian invasion that took place in 587 586 BC, when Jerusalem was sacked by her enemies. It seemed logical enough that the ark would have been among the items carried off by the invaders. Yet for some odd reason, the ark was never mentioned as one of the goodies stolen during the conquest of Jerusalem. Such an incredible and infamous item would certainly have been mentioned if it was acquired, but there was just silence. It's for this reason that some began to wonder if it was quietly removed and transferred somewhere else, just prior to the sacking of Jerusalem. And that's just a guess, but nobody seemed to know where it might have been taken. The idea that it was hidden away in Ethiopia in the meantime actually comes from the Ethiopians themselves. For this account of the ark's whereabouts first appeared in a medieval text called the Kebra Nogast. The book relays the story of how the Ethiopian queen of Sheba visited King Solomon, and they entered into an illicit affair, an affair that produced a son that she named Menelik. Supposedly from Menelik that the royal line of Ethiopians who would rule the Ethiopian Empire, which lasted for several centuries, duly emerged. Bit ironic that an illegitimate child be held in such esteem. And this irony was not lost on Ethiopian revolutionaries who overthrew the monarchy in the 1970s. They did frequently mock and indeed assassinated European Emperor Haile Selassie in 1975, referring to him as being descended from an illegitimate tryst between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. It's believed that Solomon's illegitimate son Menelik and his mother connived a way to get the ark away from Solomon. A lot of Ethiopians seem to believe this conspiracy theory to be true and insist that the ark is hidden somewhere in the north of the country. More specifically, it's been suggested the ark is hidden inside the Church of Our Lady of Zion in Aksum, Ethiopia, guarded by Ethiopian Orthodox priests at all times. In fact, to this very day in 2025, there's a designated priest in place at this monastery, charged with watching over the hidden ark until his death. And prior to his demise, he carefully chooses his own successor to do the same thing. Well, the rumors about the ark eventually reached Western ears, and Scottish explorer James Bruce made his way to Ethiopia in the year 1768 to find out for himself. But despite his efforts, it doesn't seem Mr. Bruce was ever given access. Move fast forward a couple of centuries later, in 1941, a researcher named Edward Ullendorf, who was stationed with the British Army in Ethiopia during World War II, claimed to have actually seen the ark. Now, Ethiopia had been temporarily occupied by fascist Italy, but the British, along with a group of Ethiopian freedom fighters, had led by the deposed Ethiopian monarch, Haile Selassie, would have pushed the Italians out. Ullendorf himself became friendly with Haile Selassie, and this friendship apparently led to granting him access to what nobody else had gotten access to, the supposed Ark of the Covenant. Mr. Ulandor claimed he was taken to see the Ark, but he didn't seem too impressed. He described it as being just an old wooden box. But maybe looks are deceiving. Maybe that wooden box has untold powers that most of us could hardly imagine. Or so the conspiracy theorists would like us to believe. Well, we've done 141 books. We did one on the assassination of Malcolm X. And that's become a major conspiracy theory in and of itself. The Nation of Islam is some really shadowy conspiratorial origins, since it was started by a mysterious figure whose identity remains largely a mystery. Sometimes known as Wallace D. Ford or Wallace Fard. Many, however, contend that both those names are aliases. Nobody really knows the true background of this individual. And this mystery man founded the Nation of Islam, seemingly disappeared into thin air before passing the baton to leadership in 1933 to the much more well-known Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad. It was Elijah Muhammad would bring the group to national prominence. Strangely enough, Mr. Ford first emerged on the scene working as a door-to-door salesman. During his rounds, he frequently visited the neighborhood in Detroit, Michigan, where Elijah lived. But rather than just selling his wares, Mr. Ford was also selling an entire philosophy. He had a strange, radical philosophy which borrowed from the religion of Islam. These borrowings, however, were largely superficial, since the actual teachings of Ford really had nothing at all to do with Islam. He taught an Afrocentric version of history in which he claimed that those of African descent were the first humans on the planet. In ancient times, ruled the earth with advanced technology and science. Strange conspiratorial story of a lost civilization, and Ford claimed that only by embracing his teachings could his audience, who were primarily African Americans, reclaim their place as the most advanced civilization on the planet. Might come as a surprise to some, but the Nation of Islam is also an early UFO cult, because Ford unabashedly claimed that he had been in contact with what he referred to as men from Mars. People he spoke to were mostly poor, desperate souls seeking a way out of their very difficult life circumstances. Despite some of the more outlandish notions Ford peddled, he seemed to offer hope for a better future. And a lot of folks eagerly listened to what he had to say, including Elijah Muhammad. Elijah was enthralled by Ford and soon became his right-hand man. And it was Ford, in fact, who convinced Elijah to change his surname from Poole to that of Muhammad, following the cult's tradition of adopting Islamic names, which continues with the Nation of Islam to this very day. Now, Elijah was an eager early adherent and began to become a big promoter of the Nation of Islam's backed schools. Michigan authorities were suspicious, though, and began to question the group. And this pressure led Elijah and Ford moving to Chicago in 1934. Ford went along in Chicago because by February he had seemingly disappeared entirely. Elijah always insisted Ford wasn't long for the world. Not that he died or anything like that, but rather he left the planet entirely. And to this very day, it's a core tenet of the Nation of Islam's belief that Ford left the planet Earth on a UFO, or as the Nation of Islam described it, the mother wheel. Interestingly, in what seemed to be a direct mimicry of Christian scripture, which states that Christ, who ascended into the clouds, will return in a like manner, Nation of Islam teaches of a similar second coming, and that just as Ford left on a UFO, he's one day going to come back on a UFO. In any case, it was after Ford disappeared that Elijah assumed full leadership of the group, ended up moving to D.C., where he continued to propagate the faith over the next few years. Ministry was interrupted in 1942, though, when he and several other Nation of Islam members were arrested for allegedly draft dodging. And it's true there was a war on, and the U.S. had indeed instituted a draft, but Elijah, for one, was too old at this point to even be considered for military service. Draft age is typically 18 to 35, and he was 45. U.S. intelligence agencies such as the CIA and the FBI had long been looking into the Nation of Islam, and they didn't like what they saw by any means. In particular, they were alarmed at anti-American and pro-Japanese propaganda that some members of the group had been preaching. Japan had just bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the Nation of Islam seemed to be cheering them on. This, of course, didn't sit well with the authorities. Disturbed by the radical nature of the group, they were likely trying to find any reason they could to arrest its leadership. Elijah ended up being detained for the rest of the war and wasn't released until 1945. It was this time behind bars which led Elijah to turn his attention to the prison system. He began to actively convert incarcerated individuals to the cause. And one of these individuals was a man by the name of Malcolm Little. It was, of course, Malcolm Little who would change his name to Malcolm X and become the right-hand man of Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X began to see things differently by the early 1960s, though, and became disenchanted with the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Real turning point came when Malcolm X made a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Here he encountered Muslims from all over the world adhered to the original traditional faith of Islam, which Malcolm X realized, with the exception of the barest of superficial features, had nothing at all to do with Elijah's Nation of Islam. One of the things that struck him most was that he saw people of all races and ethnicities joining together as brothers under the banner of Islam. This was, of course, quite contrary to the Afrocentric teachings of the Nation of Islam in the U.S. Touched by this unity, Malcolm X decided to renounce the Nation of Islam and embrace more traditional Islamic faith. And this, of course, put him in direct odds with his old benefactor, Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X was now considered a heretic, an enemy of the Nation of Islam. On February 21st, 1965, during a speaking engagement at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York, that Malcolm X actually met his end. As was his fashion, he strode up to the podium and spoke boldly and without fear. His security detail was minimal, as Malcolm had the attitude if somebody really wanted to kill him, there was likely not much he could do about it. Unfortunately, he'd be proved correct in this estimation of events. Malcolm had barely said a few words before a terrible commotion erupted. Somebody in the audience was shouting at somebody else to get their hands off of him. Malcolm was heard trying to calm down the commotion when somebody in the back set off a smoke bomb. And this made for quite a distraction, and nobody really knew what to make of it, as others in the crowd tried to deal with the explosion. It was a distraction that might have served its purpose, though, because while all eyes were on the smoke in the back of the room, a man suddenly jumped up from the front of the auditorium, pulled out a sawed-off shotgun, and began shooting right up at the stage. Malcolm X took a bullet to the chest. If that wasn't bad enough, suddenly a couple of other guys ran up onto the stage and took out handguns and fired at Malcolm at point-blank range. Well, Malcolm X, of course, was hit with multiple bullets, and in his chaotic overkill, his assailants made sure he didn't stand a chance. The crowd, of course, was in a frenzied panic as Malcolm's lifeblood poured out of him. Shooters took off, but one of them, Talmadge Hayer, was shot in the leg by one of Malcolm's men. The injured man struggled to get away and was chased outside. Angry crowd surrounded him and began beating him. There was a good chance mob justice might have taken place right there on the spot if the police hadn't shown up and broken up the agitated crowd. Man was detained and Malcolm was taken to the hospital, even though he was very likely already dead. He was officially pronounced dead upon his arrival at the hospital. In the aftermath, police investigated the crime scene and found the assassins had left behind the weapons. Found a sawed-off shotgun, a pistol, and 12-gauge shotguns, one of the several rounds of ammunition. Next day, Malcolm X's former teacher, Elijah Muhammad, didn't mince his words. Rather than showing any sympathy or concern, he bluntly stated Malcolm X got what he deserved. Ironically, though Malcolm was actually pulling away from a less militant stance to a more universal, accepting form of traditional Islam, Elijah seemed to suggest it was Malcolm's own violent nature that attracted such violence to him. But even worse than his remarks, Elijah almost seemed to implicate himself in the killing. For Elijah was heard to say Malcolm died according to his preaching. He seemed to have taken weapons as his God. Therefore, we couldn't tolerate a man like that. He preached war, we preached peace. Elijah stated the Nation of Islam could not tolerate a man like Malcolm X. Did that mean that Elijah had signed off on his killing? A lot of folks back then, as well as today, who felt that that was indeed the case. If Elijah was the mastermind, though, it would take many peels of the onion to get back to him as the source, since he had many underlings who were willing to do his dirty work for him. And in the immediate days after the assassination, a lot of his cronies would be arrested. Just a couple of weeks after the killing, assassination participants Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson were arrested. They were also members of the Nation of Islam. But could any clear link back to Elijah Muhammad be found? Well, if there were, it seems the investigators might not have tried really hard to find them. There have long been accusations that the NYPD who handled the case, as well as the intelligence agents who might have been involved, may not have given their best efforts, or even worse, may have actively worked to shield Elijah. It's long been the suspicion of some folks that although Elijah Muhammad was Malcolm X's killer in what was clearly a case of one religious leader wanting to kill his rival, the police and the intelligence communities are quite okay with that. They may have felt that Malcolm X, who'd groundswell of support, especially from the younger generation, may have posed a greater threat to the status quo than Elijah Muhammad and his wacky beliefs ever did. Could be they decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Decided not to pursue obvious links back to Elijah Muhammad. Once they arrested the gunman, they didn't look any further. Those diehard zealots of the Nation of Islam apparently refused to implicate their leader. The Nation of Islam moved on, and in 1972, Elijah made Louis Farrakhan the spokesman of the group. After Elijah Muhammad's death, a few years later, in 1975, another power struggle would erupt when Elijah's son, Warith ad-Din Muhammad, like Malcolm X, decided to take the group into a more traditional version of Islam. Farrakhan, who had proved to be the diehard supporter of Ford and Elijah's more Afrocentric and UFO cult-style teachings. To this day, and Farrakhan's proclaiming the virtues of the mother wheel and the second coming of Wallace D. Ford. Nation of Islam's since shrunk to a very small group, but its radical and thought-provoking ideology still piques plenty of interest. For example, in 1995, Farrakhan organized a so-called Million Man March on D.C., which generated quite a bit of media attention. Then President Bill Clinton seemed to have had mixed feelings about the event. On one hand, he commended Farrakhan for bringing people together for a cause. On the other hand, he condemned some of Farrakhan's rhetoric, which he considered to be divisive. Part of this divisiveness is in regard to some of Farrakhan's unabashedly anti-Semitic sentiments. He's openly made such remarks on many occasions. Besides their divisive nature, many of Farrakhan's remarks are also quite out of this world. Eventually claimed he himself was an alien abductee and been personally taken on board the Mother Wheel spaceship, where he was introduced to Elijah Muhammad. Well, despite his dwindling numbers, Farrakhan still holds a steady grip on the Nation of Islam. Like I say, Malcolm X, meanwhile, has been decidedly stunted. He's viewed as a martyr by some, but both Elijah as well as Farrakhan's sentiments have seemingly snuffed out any chance of real martyrdom among the Nation of Islam faithful. The conspiratorial nature of Malcolm's killing, meanwhile, remains quite clear, since it was a group effort involving multiple people with varying tactics. From the smoke bomb diversion to the multiple gunmen, it's clear this assassination was well planned. But the question is, planned by who? To this day, nobody really knows, and the conspiracy's silence as to who really ordered this hit remains as firmly in place as ever. Well, turning from Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, we probably all heard the phrase that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, we have all likely heard this expression at some point in our lives. The meaning and the origin of this sentiment might often be lost on a lot of us in the modern world. First of all, who was Nero? He was a Roman emperor in the 1st century. He presided over the Roman Empire during a crucial period of its existence, from 54 to 68 A.D. One of the reasons that this period was so crucial is the fact that it was under his reign that Christianity first began to rapidly spread throughout the Roman Empire. Jesus Christ is believed to have ended his earthly ministry. Whether you believe he was physically resurrected and ascended to heaven is up to you, about 33 A.D. After his departure, his disciples began to vigorously promote the Christian faith, starting in the Middle East and then in surrounding regions. By the time of Nero, Christianity had a strong following in the city of Rome itself. Nero didn't appreciate this, and like many of the Roman elite of this period, viewed Christians as a threat to the status quo. A lot of their beliefs seemed to be antithetical to Roman rule at the time, and so an active effort was made to suppress Christianity. That became standard procedure, so to speak. Things then came to a head when Rome was suddenly engulfed in a terrible fire, destroying a lot of lives and a lot of property. I mean, it's hard to realize today the scope of the calamity, but it was a devastating and shocking event. Some might even say it seemed downright apocalyptic. And in that lies a clue as to what might have happened in the aftermath, because the Christians were constantly preaching that the old world would pass away in apocalyptic fires prior to the return of Christ, so it was quite easy to blame the fires that engulfed Rome on the zealot Christian sect that preached that Rome itself would one day be burned to cinders. Not hard to connect the dots there at all. So was it Nero scapegoated the Christians and not only claimed that a few radicals were to blame for setting the fire, but that all the Christians collectively were to blame and had to be punished? This kick-started a most terrible persecution of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. The Romans in this era had perfected torturous executions. As the Romans, after all, devised a process of crucifixion that had been used to kill Jesus. Christians believed he was physically resurrected and later ascended to heaven, but regardless of that belief, whether or not resurrection occurred, it was a terrible death to undergo. Nero didn't let his Roman forebears down either, because he proved he too could perfect torturous death to a fine art. Soon he was putting Christians on full display, hanging them from the rafters and setting them on fire. At the time, it seems that most of the Romans were in agreement with Nero that the Christians were a radical sect who were responsible for the burning of Rome, but this belief didn't last. And soon the mood shifted, and rather than being satisfied with scapegoating the Christians, they began to blame Nero himself for the destruction. There were soon stories about how Nero had secretly ordered the burning of his own city in order to make room for new lavish construction projects. And there were new rumors afoot that Nero was not only in approval of the death and destruction of the great fire brought, but that he was happy about it. So happy, in fact, he was witnessed laughing and playing his fiddle while the fire raged. That's indeed where the expression Nero fiddled while Rome burned came from. But frankly, the question is it true? Did Nero embark on a major conspiratorial plan to destroy huge sections of Rome just so he could rebuild that city in his own image? Well, it could be true. British emperors were known to do some power-mad things, and Nero was certainly no exception. But still, burning down huge sections of one's own city is a bit of a stretch, even for Nero. In any case, Nero actually had a good alibi, which in retrospect seems to absolve him of guilt, since he wasn't even in Rome at the time. He was at his personal villa in Antium, 35 miles away. Since folks didn't have cell phones back then, Nero couldn't have texted fellow conspirators in Rome and told them to set the city on fire. So if Nero was responsible, it remains a mystery how he could have ordered somebody to start the fire when he wasn't in the city. A lot of historians now believe that as much as Nero blamed the Christians in later years after the Roman Empire actually became Christian and transformed into the Roman Catholic Empire, early Christian writers flipped the script and gave the old emperor a taste of his own medicine and turned Nero into a scapegoat. Well, so what really happened with the fire? Were Christian terrorists to blame for like Nero suggested, or was Nero to blame? Or was it something else entirely? In all reality, it could have just been a terrible accident. I mean, accidental fires are known to erupt in the crowded city of Rome, and since there was no such things as a manned fire department or some other rapid response team to put out the flames, it didn't take much for an unattended fire to burn out of control. Even so, Nero fell out of favor among the suspicious Roman public. Even his inner circle turned on him, and Nero ended up committing suicide. Interestingly, the Christian book of Revelation is believed to have been written a couple of decades later. It speaks of a beast of a ruler. It may be a reference to Nero, said because the book of Revelation declares the number of the beast is 666, and a numerical translation renders 666 as Nero. The book of Revelation states that the beast will be killed from a fatal wound, only to be resurrected in a counterfeit version of Christ's own resurrection. Well, Nero killed himself by slitting his own throat. So was the book of Revelation predicting this man who scapegoated the Christians and led such a vicious persecution one day return from the grave? And even if it wasn't the so-called Nero Bedivius, Interesting word. Legend was already making the rounds. Legend spoke about Nero having either faked his own death or that he would be supernaturally resurrected. To this day, nobody really knows who or what was responsible for the Great Fire of Rome, or whether Nero may have played a stringed instrument while it all burned down. Well, our next conspiracy theory is still with us today. Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna was born on the 18th of June, 1901. First child of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of the Russian Empire, and his wife, the hated Alexandra. Tsarina Alexandra was hated by a large majority of the Russian people for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the Russians had a xenophobic hatred of all things German, which was not helped when Germany and Russia went to war in 1914. That was during World War I, don't you know? Alexandra just so happened to be of German heritage, a fact that the Russians never let her forget, since I routinely demonstrated their contempt by calling her that German lady. Another source of their hatred was their closeness with a strange Russian monk named Rasputin. The monkish Rasputin had come to prominence due to his ability to heal Anastasia's brother, Alexei, of symptoms brought on from the hemophilic disorder he suffered from. Nobody really knows how he was able to calm this troubled child, although theories range from his use of hypnotism to outright supernatural powers that the strange monk yielded. In any case, the Russian people were suffering under the great economic duress and wartime trauma, didn't appreciate the Russian royal family consulting with a monk who apparently had a penchant for drinking and orgies and other less than reputable behavior. Soon the royal family was overthrown outright. Communists took over and Russia became the Soviet Union. But in between all that, the Russian royal family had been imprisoned. All of them were executed. Or at least that was the story. Herein lies the conspiracy. One of the royals is believed to have somehow escaped his grisly fate. It was rumored that the beautiful young Anastasia was allowed to escape and lived on in hiding. And that rumor continued to spread until in 1920 a woman who called herself Anna Anderson claimed to actually be Anastasia. Actually living in Berlin, Germany, the same hated Germany of the Tsarina's youth. The story apparently came to life after she jumped off a bridge in what was supposedly a suicide attempt. She was rescued, but when she was revived, she claimed she was suffering from amnesia. She was taken to a psychiatric facility where somebody actually began speaking in length of how she resembled the Russian royals. At that point, Anna seemed to latch onto this sentiment and either admitted or remembered she was indeed Anastasia. She claimed she survived the massacre that killed the rest of her family when a soldier felt sorry for her and helped smuggle her out of the execution chamber by hiding her in a blanket. According to the story, she and that young soldier began an affair. She claimed she was so thankful for the rescue that she fell in love with the man. So they got married and went off to live in Romania. But here, things took another tragic turn when her rescuer turned husband perished in a street fight, and the child she had with him was placed in an orphanage. She claimed it was then that she went to Berlin and out of despair tried to kill herself. It was something of a strange, thought-provoking story. This claimant to the Russian throne got quite a bit of attention. While she was riding high on all this, she moved to America and married a man named John Monahan, becoming Anastasia Monahan. Spent the rest of her days in Charlottesville, Virginia, until she passed away in 1984. Never recanted the story she told. To this day, there are still those who wonder if it might be true. Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back on Monday, because this is Friday. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great weekend.